Hi, I'm Janet Terhune, and we're here at the Harness Racing Museum and Hall of Fame in Goshen, New York on August 31st, 2014. And we're here to interview Dr. Brennan, a renowned veterinarian friend, and we just want to interview him to find out what he knows and wants to tell us about Roosevelt and his early days in the horse world. Dr. Brennan, how did you get started?
Well, I graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, and the head professor of surgery recommended Aiken, South Carolina, as a place that I would always have horses and a wonderful place to raise the family. So I went to Aiken and worked for Dr. McLean for 2 years, and in those 2 years I met various trainers of standardbred horses, mainly Frank Irvin, and besides Frank, at that time, there was Fred Egan, there was Sepp Palin, who had a second trainer whose name was Jimmy Wingfield, who cared for Greyhound when Sepp Palin was a racehorse, the greatest trotter of all time. And Jimmy was the second trainer. And there were, I'd say, 5 or 6 others. Tom Murphy was retired, and in one of those years, the Buck family came and with horses, and one of Frank's second trainers, Ned Bauer, was then the trainer, but at that time is when I met Tom Murphy, who had a title of the Wizard of the Reins, I was told. After 2 years, I actually bought the practice and continued to treat the standardbred horses at a time when Mr. Kane had a string of horses with Frank Irvin, and I recall Frank telling me the first time that Mr. Kane visited, he walked down the line of the stable and he didn't see his favorite horse. So the question, as Frank told me the story, was that Mr. Kane wanted to know where the little horse was, and Frank had him on the back side of the barn. And he said, oh, just temporarily. And from that moment on, Good Time, as a yearling, had a front stall because that was Mr. Kane's favorite horse. And he went on to be one of the greatest racehorses of that era. And while racing, the only horse that I ever saw that could make 2 or 3 moves in a race, it was like driving a car. And when he'd win a race, Frank, being the showman that he would be, he'd be bringing him back past the stands. And it would be on a walk, and Frank would tap him with the whip, and he'd take a few, and then he'd go walking again. And the showmanship, the crowd would just take off. It was a wonderful experience to see such a great horse. And I'll refer to him a little later. But in those early years, in probably 1949, 2 years younger than I, and Billy Houghton came to Aiken, and he had 9 horses at that time. And there was a family next to me that had a rooming house, and that's where Billy lived. So we became dear friends with Billy coming over and playing canasta, that type of thing, no television. And always telling me about New York. And so our association grew. The next year he came back, and I think he had maybe 18, and the next year he came back and he had 35. And then Billy, during that time, and I think it was about 1950, there was a training center outside of Orlando called Ben White Raceway. And that's where the greatest number of harness horses were trained. And Billy went there, and he had, over the years that he was stabled, he had a number of 120 to 25 horses. So from that beginning, and then later, it was even greater numbers than that. But the two people that was Frank Irvin and Billy Houghton that kept encouraging me to maybe go to New York. And so I did go up in 1951. That was the year after Mr. Kane built and had the inaugural race at Yonkers Racetrack. It had been a thoroughbred track at one time. And Billy won the first inaugural race and gave me a photo. And the horse's name was Navy Hal, and he went in 2 minutes and 5 seconds to win the inaugural pace. And the purse was $5,000. In the winning picture is Mr. Kane. That was 1950. And the representative was a page boy of Philip Morris Cigarettes, and his name, they called him Johnny, and his was not to advertise cigarettes, but call for Philip Morris, and those three. And also in those years, the drivers just had a little felt hat, no protection at all to them. So I met a number of, through Billy, the first person that he introduced me to was Delvin Miller, who was a giant at that time in racing and a good friend of Billy's, and one of the most influential people that I continued to know, and the great people he had working for them. In fact, was told just this year that one of them is 100 years old. And to go back to Aiken, there was one year, and it probably was about 1950, when Frank said, Doc, when are you going to go to Ben White again? And I mentioned maybe next week or so. He said, I want to ride down with you. Yeah, I'm thinking of taking a new job. And so we went, and I worked a couple of days at Ben White, and then we headed down to Pompano. And when we got to the road, we came to a cyclone fence, and Frank said there was no buildings there that you could see. And there was an open chain gate there. So he got out, and we drove in, scrub oak on a Carl, and there was an opening, a track training. No other buildings, but 3 little barns, and Curly Smart, who I had gotten to know, was training for Castleton Farm, and Frank was going to take that job eventually, like in a year. And I had a silent thought that I never mentioned, but I wondered why in the world anybody would ever build a track in this godforsaken place. And that was Pompano Racetrack that was built by originally the daughter of Chrysler Motors.
Right. Francis Dodge.
I go back to, again, Roosevelt Raceway. I wasn't there at the beginning, but the 3 people that built was a Mr. Johnson, who the daughter married, and a man by the name of Valentine, who was a real estate, and George Morton Levy. And they were, I didn't get to know Mr. Johnson very much, but Mr. Valentine I did. And he went through the barn area every morning. And if he saw something amiss, it wasn't amiss anymore, and that fella got a notice. I mean, that's how he directed. And George Morton Levy was, when his health was good, he was always at the races, and a wonderful, wonderful ownership of Roosevelt Raceway.